Okay, this is chapter 2, section 2, titled The Coming of Independence. And so this is going to outline the process of the United States going from the 13 colonies under Great Britain to us becoming a free and independent nation. And so you have three key terms for this section. For this piece, and we're combining multiple pieces that we would normally do over the course of a week into one section of notes today. So the first term is one we've actually used before. It's confederation, and it's the joining of several different groups for a common purpose. And we defined confederation back when we looked at the different forms of government, because confederation is a form of government, and it's a form of government that has existed in the United States. The second term up there is the Albany Plan of Union. And this is a plan proposed by Benjamin Franklin that would have had all 13 colonies form a Congress to raise armed forces, regulate trade, and deal jointly with the Native Americans. And so this would have taken place in 1754, before the United States was an independent country. And then the last term up there is a simple one you've probably seen, but maybe haven't known exactly what it means. A delegate is just another word for a representative. So when we come across delegate, it is just a representative. Events and ideas that led to American independence. This is an outline. We'll go into each section with a little bit more detail here in a few minutes. But this is the basic process that took place. So you had unpopular British colonial policies like taxation without representation. So the colonies weren't happy with how they were being run. And so the colonies start to come together, and you've got growing political unity where they start to unite together and then protest those British policies. So you've got the 13 colonies coming together, protesting the British policies. And then in response to that, the British try and crack down on the colonies for showing some degree of independence that eventually leads to fighting and an outbreak of the Revolutionary War between the colonists and the British soldiers. And again, we'll go into each step in this process with a little bit more detail on the next slides. But this is the overall big picture of what this process of the United States becoming the United States was. So the British colonial policies for many years, the colonies had become used to a certain degree of self-rule. In large part, that was out of necessity. The colonies were a couple months' trip away from Great Britain, from the Crown. So the distance made it hard for Parliament to manage and control colonial affairs or to enforce trade laws or any laws for that matter. So they were very much dependent on their representatives in the colonies. But there were some things that the colonies could do to keep those people living there in check, who reported back to the Crown. And so because of this, the colonial governments and legislatures took on more power, and they started to withhold pay from the governors who disagreed with their legislative proposals. And so that's what I mentioned just previously, is that the colonists were the ones who were in charge of approving the governor's pay. The governors reported back to the Crown. If the colonists wanted something, they would just withhold the pay of the governor until the governor reported back the information the way in which the colonists wanted. So it was a little bit of manipulation by the colonial legislatures. And so the British, while the colonies are basically doing quite a bit of self-governing, did provide defense against attack from the outside. They did manage the colonies' foreign affairs and provided a standard currency and markets for trade. So this isn't just a relationship where the colonies are being abused by the Crown. The colonies are also getting something out of it. And during this time frame, taxation on the colonies was relatively low, and their interference with colonial affairs, as we've already outlined, was minimal. That changes, however, and it changes in 1760. When King George III comes to power. And when he does so, he asks Parliament to expand and enforce laws to control colonial trade. Britain needs money. They see the colonies as a way to add to their pockets. And so Parliament passes new taxes to help pay for the British troops that are stationed in North America. So we're helping to defend you. You need to pay for it. The colonists are saying that this is not just because they don't have any say in the British government. And so they say that they are being taxed without representation. And that kind of becomes a rallying cry behind the American Revolution. The British leaders ignore these colonial complaints. So there are some early efforts to unite the colonies. They do ultimately fail, but they set the stage for what takes place over the course of the next couple of decades. So in 1754, Benjamin Franklin, as we've already mentioned, proposed the Albany Plan of Union, and it would have created a colonial Congress where each colony would have had a representative. Ultimately, it was rejected, and so it didn't come to fruition. But again, it did set the stage for future similar groups. In 1765, Great Britain passes another tax known as the Stamp Act, and what it requires is a stamp to be purchased for all legal documents and newspapers in the colonies. Obviously, the colonies didn't like that additional tax. And so in response to the Stamp Act, 9 colonies gather together, so 9 of the 13, and form the Stamp Act Congress. And they send a declaration of rights and grievances to King John III. So this is them declaring what they feel like their rights are as colonies, and also what their complaints are against the British. And so they send that to the king. This is important because it is the first time there is unified colonial protest. Parliament then responds by repealing that Stamp Act. So the colonies protest the British actions, and the British step back. So there's success in the colonies. What this does is encourages unity amongst the colonists. So new laws are continually passed during this time period that anger the colonists, and so the colonists begin responding first with boycotts and then actions of violence. And this is organized through something called the Committees of Correspondence. So this is the organized resistance against the British. And so you have events like the Boston Massacre and Boston Tea Party take place that increase the tensions. And you should have learned about those, I think in 8th grade history, to be honest, but we'll watch a video at some point that will provide a little bit of context for each one of those events. And so this sets the stage in 1774 for what's known as the First Continental Congress. And it's in response to a series of acts passed by the British known as the Intolerable Acts. So again, our time frame here, 1774, they're meeting in Philadelphia. There is a delegate from every colony but Georgia, and some of the people present are big names in American history and American government. So John Adams, George Washington, and John Jay are all there. Ultimately, what they do at the First Continental Congress is send a Declaration of Rights to King George, protesting the colonial policies. So basically saying this is what we should be able to do as colonies. They urged the colonists to boycott trade with England until the tax laws were repealed. And eventually it gains support of all 13 colonies, including Georgia. And probably the biggest thing is they set up an agreement to meet again. So in the First Continental Congress, they meet, they do a few things. The most important of which, though, is they say, we're going to do this again. And so that second meeting takes place in Philadelphia in 1775. This time, every colony does send a delegate. John Hancock is chosen as president of the Second Continental Congress. And I do want to be clear, he is president of the Second Continental Congress. He is not president of the United States because the United States does not exist yet. And by this point, the Revolutionary War had already started. So they're meeting in 1775. Fighting between the British and the colonies has already begun with the battles of Lexington and Concord. Again, hopefully a quick refresher from 8th grade. but if not, you'll see this depicted in a video we'll watch. And the colonies create an army, and George Washington is named commander-in-chief of those forces. The Second Continental Congress is super important. It will be on the EOC, I can almost guarantee it. The Congress became America's first government, and so it wasn't necessarily intentional, but because the war had already started, we needed some way to work together. And so the Congress was the government that ran the United States from 1776 until 1781. The Second Continental Congress had legislative and executive powers. And during the war, it did all the things that you would expect a government would do. So it raised the military, created a money system, and made foreign treaties. So during the war, we did make treaties with other countries, in some cases to help us fight the British. And Benjamin Franklin, pictured there on the right, was a leading member. He was one of the most senior members. He was in his, I think, 70s or 80s during this time frame. And so one of the first decisions that the Second Continental Congress makes is to break away from Great Britain. So we are going to become free and independent. And so this group of guys, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson, were named to write the Proclamation of Independence. While they were all named to do it, like any group project, a lot of the responsibility fell on one person, and that was the youngest person in the group, and that was Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson was in charge of writing this Proclamation of Independence, and ultimately what he writes becomes the Declaration of Independence, which is declared on July 2nd, 1776, and adopted on July 4th, 1776. And so that marks the date that the United States became a free and independent country. Now that we were free, the purpose of the Declaration, and you'll see this with the activity this week that you're gonna have to do, you'll actually look at the Declaration of Independence and break down its different parts. But essentially what it did was severed ties with Great Britain, so broke us away and created a new and independent nation. And it did so under the system where the people held the power. So it was the first time a political system had ever been formed on the principles of equality, human rights, and representative government that derived its authority from the will of the people. Now, we can obviously talk about the time frame and how human rights and equality didn't actually exist in the United States at that time, but those were the principles with which the nation was founded on. And so now that we are free from Great Britain, the Congress wants each individual colony to write its own constitution, and a constitution sets up the principles, structures, and processes of government. So the colonies, or the Congress, wanted each colony to have their own individual constitution. We will talk about Missouri State Constitution at some point, but we're also spent a lot of time focused on the federal constitution. And a constitution is essentially kind of like the rule book for how the government runs in a place. And so most state constitutions were adopted in 1776 and 77. There were a couple that lingered a few years. Massachusetts was one of the later ones that was created in 1780, but it is still in use today. So the state constitution that they wrote in 1780 is still the state constitution of Massachusetts, and it's the oldest constitution that exists in the world today. When I say exists in the world, I mean it's still in use. Some of the ideas that were contained in those constitutions are ideas we've talked about in class already, and we will talk about more. I don't necessarily think you need to define these again, but just note that they were characteristic of state constitutions. So you've got the idea of popular sovereignty, limited government, civil rights and liberties, separation of powers, checks and balances. And most of them gave power to the legislature. So instead of giving it to one person, maybe like the king in England, they give it to the legislative body, so a group of people. They set short terms of office. Again, they did not want a monarchy to rule. They wanted short terms of office, and then the right to vote was limited primarily to white property owning males. So I know a lot in this section. I know I won't quick, so if you need to, feel free to rewind, pause to get these notes. But this is important stuff because it will appear on the EOC, and it sets the basis for the government that we have today.